South Florida, behind the idyllic backdrop of palm trees, warm breezes, and blue azure seas, lies a sinister secret. The underbelly of society, the criminal element, seeks to exploit and destroy the most vulnerable members of society, namely women and children. My name is Carol Magnus Stanhope. I'm a survivor of MK Ultra government experimentation and human trafficking, and this is my story.
Carol, where are you from?
I'm a farmer's daughter, born to Finnish American immigrants from Duluth, Minnesota, back in 1962. I'm 56 years old currently.
And at what age did the exploitation start?
Well, my earliest recollection was approximately between 1966 and 1967. I was 4 to 5 years old. This is when the MK Ultra and Monarch government experimentation and mind control started. I believe that this was due to my father's involvement in the Freemasons, more specifically the Shriners and Royal Orders of the Jesters. And I believe that he was blackmailed into offering up his children for this MK Ultra mind control experimentation. I have earliest recollections at 4 to 5 years old of being taken to very clinical settings. Now in retrospect and what I've been able to gather, I believe I was taken to the University of Minnesota and Duluth Air Force Base. And I have recollections of being subjected to different experiments, cutting of my flesh, forced ingestion of urine, sensory deprivation, being kept in very claustrophobic and dark spaces for long periods of times, sexual abuse, and the like. I have one particular memory where I came home in a very drug-induced state, but I was cognizant enough to know that I had blood-soaked bandages on my forehead and on my forearms. And I believe that this was due to the experimentation, the poking and the prodding, if you will, to see what, makes us tick. Now, from what I've been able to gather is I come from a line of our family line is a lot of Rh negative bloodlines, and I understand that the governments of the world are very interested in experimenting on these children because only about 7-15% of the world's population of approximately 8 billion people has this blood, and that translates to only maybe 560 million people total worldwide that actually have this blood. Now I understand that this is from the Lost Tribes of Israel. If you want to look that up, there's many good references online talking about how the Lost Tribes of Israel, who were taken into captivity by the Assyrians and then the Babylonians respectively, they all had this blood, and for some reason these governments around the world, they like to experiment on us, and it's unethical, it's illegal. I believe that it's still going on to this day, but I think it's gone more underground, it's more covert.
What year did you move to Florida?
My father sold our farm in Minnesota in 1969. The farming industry was starting to suffer. Some of the big conglomerates, the commercial dairies and grain processors were buying out the little guys, which my father had a medium-sized farm. He had grown alfalfa and wheat, and we had all the typical farm animals, cows and pigs and sheep and so forth. So my father sold everything lock, stock, and barrel at an auction and moved us to Lake Worth, Florida. back in September, I believe it was 1969.
And how did the abuse escalate into human trafficking?
Well, it seemed like I got a little reprieve. Now, when we moved to Florida, I was about 7 years old, and it seemed like I got a reprieve for a few years. My grade school years were fairly normal, not too much problems, except my father was a very abusive drunk when he was home, and he had mistresses, and finally my mother just got totally fed up with all of the womanizing and so forth, and then she divorced him when I was about 11 going on 12 years old. And but then when I started to enter into middle school, into junior high as we used to call it back then, by that time my parents had divorced, and so my father was still trying to keep a hold on me and keep me in this program. So he sent some teenagers. I mean, I was only a young girl, but he sent some older teenagers, 17, 18, 19, and maybe there was even a 20-year-old, to get me hooked on different substances, alcohol, THC, orange sunshine, LSD, and the like. And so this was this was a grooming process to get me under control, to make me more malleable, so that they could control me more. And so after these teenagers, the leader of these this Freemasonic teenage gang was Charles. And when he was sure that I was good and drunk and good and high, then they started taking me to the island of Palm Beach and filming me in child pornography, and that was very stressful for me. I mean, I was a young girl. Nobody was protecting me. Apparently, my family was fully on board with this process, to indoctrinate me into into this child pornography ring and this lifestyle. And I just wasn't protected because of this subculture. This Freemasonic subculture that is perpetrated by the Shriners and the Royal Order of the Jesters, who have been arrested in recent years. It's all verifiable. In a human trafficking ring, they were trafficking young girls from Brazil, illegal immigrants, you name it. It was a big human trafficking sting. So there is a precedent for this. They're known to do this. They did it 40 years ago when I was young, and they're still doing it.
How did you get away from your pornographer?
Well, that's a very interesting twist into the story, and it was actually divine intervention in my estimation. God really had my back. I had met some nice people from the Caving Society, the Speleological Society of Florida up in Gainesville. And this gentleman, Paolo, he was not obviously affiliated with the people in the child pornography ring, quite the contrary. He's a very educated man, very kind man, and so he had offered for me to start going on caving expeditions up in northern and central Florida. And so that was very therapeutic for me, quite a contrast to being exploited by what I would call monsters. This is organized crime. They prey on children and illegal immigrants and poor women without a lot of resources. So, you can, they're just predators. You can liken it to, a lion waiting in the tall grass, waiting for a sick or a lame animal to come by. I mean, they're cowards. I mean, they prey on the weakest, subjects in our society, and they have to be stopped. So, my friends, in the caving society, they were very kind to me. I spent several months going back and forth to Gainesville and Ocala, going on different expeditions, learning how to survey the aquifer. I mean, this was, a great experience for me, being, a young teenager at this point. So then when I returned, Charles, who was the leader of this teenage gang, this child pornography ring, if you will, started to threaten me, saying, I'm going to hurt you and I'm going to hurt your family if you don't continue making the films. He, at one point, he came by my house, and I was, trying desperately to break away, trying desperately not to answer the door, and he was pounding on the windows and the doors like a madman. He ended up breaking some of the windows out of my mother's house, and so then finally, after several months of threats and harassment and stalking, I guess he finally, and by the grace of God, I should say, he finally gave up and left me alone, or so I thought.
Did Charles leave you alone after all of that?
Well, one would think so. He was very persistent, relentless, in fact. But I didn't hear from him for a few months, so I thought that all was well and I had finally gotten away. So with my new group of friends, I had some lovely friends at that time, and we were just typical, hippies, doing our thing, loving life, loving music back then. We started out August 1976 to this bluegrass festival, which was being held in a large wooded area in West Palm Beach, Florida, west of our town. And if you're of any age, you remember that hitchhiking, although dangerous, was very popular back then. And that's how the hippies and the young counterculture got around if they didn't have a car or you couldn't use your parents' car. So long story short, we stuck our thumbs out on the highway this balmy August day. I believe it was late morning, maybe after 11. And it was my girlfriend and my guy friend. They were not in any way involved in the child pornography ring, at least not to my knowledge, they were not. And pretty soon this white Econoline van happened along, and it was two guys in mid-late 20s. And they said, "Oh, where are you going? Are you going to the festival?" And we said, "Yes." And it's like, well, they're like, "We are too." And they're like, "Hop in." And so several minutes, maybe 10 minutes into the ride, the man that was the passenger pulled a small handgun on myself and my two friends, and we were very scared, trembling in fact. And they let on that Charles had sent them, to punish me. This was a retaliation for breaking away from the child pornography ring, for defying him, for speaking out. So they drove us, at gunpoint, they drove us from West Palm Beach, Florida, up into the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Very, very scared, just beside ourselves with fear. And several hours into the trip from Florida up into the Blue Ridge of North Carolina, they stopped for hamburgers. All the while the passenger had the gun pointed at me and my two friends. And they stopped and got some hamburgers, and they forced us to eat it. They're like, you have to eat this. And so apparently it was laced with some kind of a hallucinogen. I don't know if it was LSD or orange sunshine. Those were very popular hallucinogens back then and very easy to get. So a little while, less than 30 minutes after consuming the hamburgers, we started to have hallucinations, which just compounded everything and made us even more fearful. It was not a good situation. So several hours later, after the hallucinogen finally wore off, it was very late. I believe it could have been maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. We had been driving for at least, I don't know, 10 or 12 hours. And so the hallucinogens wore off. And then our guy friends, we were sitting in the back. The passenger, the man that was the passenger, was still holding the gun on us. And he looked away momentarily, just for a moment, to speak to the driver. And so while he looked away, and the gun wasn't pointed on us for just a minute, our guy friend whispered in our ear, and he said, "On the count of 3, you all. 1, 2, 3." And he slid open the door on the van, and he pushed me and my girlfriend out. And we rolled down the side of the mountain. We got very scraped up, very banged up, very painful and bloody ride rolling down that mountain. So our guy friend was trying to figure out where we could go hide, because he knew that they were not going to give up without a fight. He said, they're going to be coming back with more men with guns, and we have to hide out. So he saw a briar patch down the bluff, which are very common in North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and it's just essentially a big thorn bush. And he said, our guy friend said, so we're going to go hide in this briar patch, this thorn bush, so when those men come back, hopefully they won't be able to find us. So I got very upset. I said, I am not going to climb into this thorn bush. I said, we're going to get all scraped up, climbing in there. We might not even survive, climbing in or climbing out of there. I said, I'm not doing it. And he said, look, it's either this or you die tonight. Which do you prefer? So, I was between a rock and a hard place. I didn't have any choice. So the 3 of us climbed into that briar patch. Must have been about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, being stuck and scratched at every angle. It's just a big bramble of thorns, essentially. So we sat quietly, and probably less than 30 minutes later, sure enough, just like our friend predicted, there was about 10, maybe 12 men with shotguns and bloodhounds circling that briar patch, and those dogs were sniffing, and we were just trembling, trying not to cry, trying to be very still, and they were just looking around. The dogs were sniffing, and they knew that we must have been in the vicinity, but those dogs were smart enough to know, those dogs were smarter than we were. They were smart enough to know they weren't going to climb into that briar patch, because they knew they were going to get scratched up, and nobody wants that. So finally, the men that was leading the search party, the people that were looking for us, finally he said, there ain't no way that they climbed into that bramble of thorns. They're not in that briar patch. He said that would kill them. He said, let's go on down the mountains. Let's go in that thicket of trees over yonder. They're probably hiding in there. So by the grace of God, they finally gave up. It seemed like hours had gone by. And then finally, dawn was breaking, And our guy friend said, okay, I think they're gone. I think it's safe to climb out of here. And as the three of us climbed out of that briar patch, we just got scraped from head to toe, scrapes on our head, our faces, our nostrils, our chest, just bleeding from head to toe. And so painful, so bloody, and I hope to never be in that situation again. That was absolutely terrifying. So we climbed back on up the mountain, back up to the highway where we had rolled down from the road, several hours before. Got back up on the road, and we were walking for a while, maybe, I don't know, it must have been under 30 minutes, and a police officer came along, and of course we were a mess, and he was kind of horrified to see, three young people, out at the crack of dawn, in bloody clothing. I mean, we looked like we had been in a massacre. And so he had us sit in the back of the cruiser and questioned us, and then he went on the teletype, and then he found out that we were the abducted teenagers from Florida. And then someone put us up, one of the North Carolina Children's Services put us up in a safe house, because we had really gone through an ordeal and they were just trying to protect us. So we stayed in a safe house overnight, and then the authorities contacted our parents, and then Florida has a agreement with many of the southern states, particularly North Carolina, because a lot of people end up in North Carolina. So they made arrangements for us to fly back, no charge to us or our parents. And so then our parents were very joyful to see us and have us back safe and sound.
Tell me how you started over after the child pornography escape.
I met a gentleman, and I'm not going to go into too much disclosure about him because this documentary isn't about him, so I'll just give you a thumbnail sketch. I met and fell in love with my husband. We had 2 children. We were together 5 years. He turned out to be very abusive, and perhaps he was involved with the same group that had abused me earlier, or he was from some other group. But apparently I was a magnet for this type of abuse and exploitation. So we had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and he had intimated to me that he wanted me to be a breeder for this criminal organization, which I believe had mafia ties here in South Florida. And so I got very, once again, I was on the run, which my whole life has been one escape from another, trying to protect myself or others. And in this instance, it was my 2 children. They're now grown adults, thank God. For the grace of God, he held us in his loving arms, close to his bosom, and protected us. But back then, I finally got away from my husband in 1985, and my children were 2 and 4 years old at that time. And we escaped up to Ocala area for a year, and I worked 2 jobs. My husband did not know where we were, and I wanted it that way. And after a year, my mother was contacting me on the phone and begging us to come home because, of course, she missed her grandchildren. And she had a large a large piece of property with 2 houses on it, and so she was able to fix up the second house on the property so that my children and I could move into it. And the day that we returned from Ocala back in 1985, this mobster, I'll call him, he was knocking on my door as we're trying to get all of our belongings back in place after we came back into town. And I opened the door, and this man, we'll call him Jorge, he said, "Oh, well, I heard you were back in town." And I was fearless because I was a mother bear. I was going to protect my children at no cost. I wasn't going to let these criminal bullies exploit my children as they had exploited me in past years. And I said to this Jorge, I said, I got right in his face. I said, I heard that you're trying to use me as a breeder and buy and sell my children. And he just laughed. He just laughed with very evil, kind of maniacal laugh, very evil grin on his face. And he said, "Well," he goes, "I don't think your mother is going to let that happen, do you?" And so after that confrontation, he left. And so then, they finally left me alone. And then I was able to divorce my husband, and just I became a single mom, and I took care of my children by myself.
Once you divorced your first husband, how are you able to function after so much trauma?
Well, like any good single mom, I jumped back into the fray, and I went back to work. I received a very lucrative offer in a catering company as a manager. One of our main accounts was catering for minor league baseball teams in the area. It was great, the outdoors in South Florida and the sunshine, and watching the great American sport, baseball. I mean, it was great, dishing up some good food. I mean, it was all good. I was making a good living. I was able to raise my children. And, and it was really, really like a new day dawning for me. It was a fresh start. So I had this friend, Maria, and I don't know, I hope she meant well. I hope she wasn't in on the perpetration, but she was trying very hard to get me to date her friend, who was this Dominican gentleman. I guess at that time, let's see, I was in my early 20s, and he was in his maybe late 20s, early 30s. And she kept on insisting, "Oh, he's a really nice guy, and you can't mistrust everybody." She's like, "Not everybody is bad, and so why don't you go out with him?" And I didn't want to do that because I was already interested in somebody else. And so I just kept declining the offer, but she was very persistent. And he kept on coming to my job when we were catering at the ball field and saying, "Hey, Mama, why don't you just give me a chance?" And it's like, "No, I'm already seeing somebody." And then one time, after I had declined his offers to go out on many occasions, he was able to, he got me one evening when I was leaving work. And he raped me very brutally. He beat me up. He pulled half of my scalp out, and as a result, I had a pregnancy as a result of the rape. And I'm a Bible-believing Christian. I practice primitive Christianity. And abortion, no matter what the circumstances, is definitely not an option for me. It hasn't been in the past, and it never will be in the future. I believe that life is sacred, And so I carried the pregnancy to term, and I went through an adoption agency, and it was a closed adoption. I don't know who the people are, and they don't know who I am. But I was only given some very vague details on who they are. I know that they're a wealthy couple from Boston, Massachusetts. And so that was 1985 that I gave up my son for adoption. It was an 8-pound baby boy. It was born as a result of this rape. And then I met my second husband. This is my second family. I met my second husband. We had 2 more children, and we're now divorced.
I understand that you've recovered from all this in the most miraculous way. Tell me about it.
Well, once again, God gets all the credit for this. My Father in heaven, the only real father that I've ever had, because my earthly father did nothing to protect me. He was actually a perpetrator, a handler, and instrumental in my abuse. So enough said about that. When I divorced my second husband, I bought a small home, and I started over with our 6-year-old daughter, raising her, many times working 2 jobs in property management. And then in my free time, I started going on the internet and researching ritual abuse, human trafficking, MK Ultra experimentation. And for those of you who are not familiar with MK Ultra, just a little side note, if you want to look it up online, there's about 15,000 pages of declassified information on this project. This project was designed by the CIA. It was unethical experiments on human beings, primarily children, through force and mind control, and the operation ran from 1953 and was halted thereabouts 1973. This is all available to you to look at through the Freedom of Information Act. It's declassified information on the MK Ultra, Monarch programs, Project Artichoke, Project Bluebird. There was many sub-projects, and this was conducted at over 100 university hospitals, Air Force bases, and prisons over a 20-year period from 1953 to 1973. And so as a result of doing all this research, and the background of how organized this abuse is, I was able to connect with 2 Canadian nurses, 2 lovely women whom I love dearly. They are my mentors, they are my protectors. They started Persons Against Ritual Abuse and Torture many, many years ago. It's now been renamed Person Against Non-State Torture. They started around 1993. They've rescued a lot of women, mentored a lot of women, not only myself, but hundreds more, too numerous to mention. As I said, they're from Truro, Nova Scotia, Canada, and I'm giving them honorable mention, and I am dedicating this documentary to them. I love you dearly, ladies. Jean Sarson and Linda McDonald. In 2006, after I started communicating with them, I submitted a 1-page statement to the United Nations on my organized abuse by secret societies. They mentored me through my trauma. Lovely, lovely women. They ended up introducing me to another MK Ultra survivor by the name of Lynn Moss Sharman. whom I miss very dearly. She passed on March 14th of 2014 at age of 66. She was a Canadian survivor of this MK Ultra child pornography, government mind control experimentation. So after I had been speaking to her, we'd been chatting online and over the telephone for several months. I traveled to Thunder Bay, Ontario to meet her, and she graciously offered her home, a room in her home to me. She counseled me and mentored me. And so then I was able to return to Florida and start my own activism. As this segment has stated, I turned my anger into activism. Then I helped the ladies, Jean Sarson and Linda McDonald, with a UN campaign that they had going. Started a petition campaign here in West Palm Beach, Florida, urging citizens to sign this petition to present to the UN in New York, and also later on in Geneva, Switzerland, at a UN summit meeting on trafficked persons and modern-day slavery. So during that time, when I was very active in this cause with the UN petition and so forth, I was harassed by the local police, constantly inviting me to leave town. And then my typical response when they would come and get in my face, because I was on the streets, I had permits to actually approach people and urge them to sign this petition. You know, I said, you know, that badge that you have there, it says to protect and serve. I said, why would you object to someone like myself, a peaceful, law-abiding citizen who has been abused all of her life by this agenda? Why would you object, you know, in trying to protect the most vulnerable members of society, which are women and children? I said, you know, perhaps, and I was livid, I was angry. I said, perhaps it's because you're part of the problem. And they just walked away shaking their heads, laughing, you know, just scoffing at me. So in conclusion, you know, most of us, all of us, if in fact, have women and children in our lives, whether it's sisters, mothers, aunts, uncles. We all have people in our lives that are vulnerable, and in my estimation, you know, we can all do a little something to protect our loved ones, or even, you know, our friends, or even the child or the woman on the street. Here in Palm Beach, now we have a very active human rights community. You know, our motto is if you see something, say something. And that's the only way that, you know, we're going to bring about any change. I don't know who said it, actually, but it's one of my favorite sayings. It says, that which flourishes in darkness withers by the light of day. And also from a biblical perspective, you know, I think it's in Philippians, it says that whatever evil deeds that they're saying and doing it in darkness, you shout it from the rooftops. And then when you bring light on this evil, you know, then things can begin to change. Thank you for listening, and God bless you.